during the course of this month. In the next one, I noticed the continual goings and comings and the frequent interviews of the first consul, different persons who were said to be members of the council, state tribunes, or senators. For a long time, the army and the majority of the citizens who idolized the hero of Italy and Egypt had openly manifested their desire to see him wear a title worthy of his renown in the grandeur of France. It was known, moreover, that it was he that did all that was done in the state, and that his pretended colleagues were really his inferiors. People thought it just that he should become supreme chief in name, since he was already so in fact. Since his fall, I have often heard his majesty called by the name of usurper, and the only effect it has ever produced upon me has been to make me laugh with pity. It is if the emperor usurped the throne. He had more accomplices than all the tyrants of tragedy and melodrama, for 3/4 of the French people were in on the plot. It is known that it was May 18th when the empire was proclaimed, and that the first consul, I shall call him the emperor hereafter, received the Senate at St. Cloud, led by Consul Cambyses, who was Arch-Chancellor of the Empire. A few hours later, it was from his mouth that the emperor heard himself for the first time saluted by the name of Sire. On issuing from this audience, the Senate went to present its homage to the Empress Josephine. The remainder of the day was passed in receptions, presentations, interviews, and felicitations. Everybody in the chateau was intoxicated with joy. Everyone produced the effect of having received a sudden promotion. They embraced. They congratulated each other. They mutually communicated their hopes and plans for the future. It was not even the meanest subaltern who was not seized with ambition. In a word, the antechamber, saving the differences of personages, offered the exact repetition of what was passing on in the salon. Nothing could be funnier than the embarrassment of all the attendants when it was a question of how to respond to the interrogations of His Majesty. They began by making mistakes, and they would correct themselves and do worse still. They repeated 10 times in a minute, "Sire, General, Your Majesty, Citizen, First Consul." Entering the Emperor's chamber next morning as usual, I replied to his customary questions. "What time is it? How is the weather?" "Sire, 7 o'clock, fine weather." Having approached his bed, he pulled my ears, struck me on the cheek, and called me Monsieur le Drôle. Funny guy. It was his favorite word for me when he was particularly pleased with my service. His Majesty had sat up and worked into the night. He looked serious and occupied, but contented. What a difference between this waking and that of the preceding March 21st. That same day, His Majesty went to hold his first grand levee at the Tuileries, where all the civil and military authorities were presented. The brothers and sisters of the Emperor were made princes and princesses, with the exception of Monsieur Lucien, who had quarreled with His Majesty on the occasion of his marriage with Madame Jouberton. 18 generals were elevated to the dignity of marshals of the empire. Everything surrounding their majesties put on a semblance of court and of royal power from this first day. A great deal has been said of the awkwardness of their first courtiers, who were very little accustomed to the service imposed on them by their new appointments and to the ceremonies of etiquette. But this has been exaggerated like everything else. There might well be in the commencement something of that embarrassment which those in the Emperor's private service experienced, as I have said above. Still, that lasted only a short time, and the chamberlains and great officers remodeled themselves almost as quickly as we valets de chambre. Moreover, there presented themselves to give them lessons a swarm of men and the former court who had obtained from the kindness of the Emperor the favor of being struck from the list of emigres, and who eagerly solicited appointments in the budding imperial court for themselves and their wives. His Majesty did not like the anniversary fetes of the Republic. Some of them had always seemed to him odious and cruel, and the others ridiculous. I have seen him grow indignant that they should have dared to make an annual fete of the 21st of January, and smile with pity at the remembrance of what he called the masquerades of the Theophilanthropists, who, said he, would have none of Jesus Christ, and made saints of Fenelon and Las Casas, Catholic prelates. Monsieur de Bourrienne says in his memoirs that it was not one of the least oddities of Napoleon's policy that he should have kept for this first year of his reign the fete of July 14th. Concerning this passage, I will permit myself to call attention to the fact that, if His Majesty profited by the epoch of an annual solemnity to appear in pomp in public, on the other hand, he so changed the object of the fete that it would have been difficult to recognize in it the anniversary of the taking of the Bastille and of the First Federation. I do not know whether there was a word said of either of these events in the whole ceremony. And to disconcert still more the souvenirs of the Republicans, the Emperor ordered that the fete should not be celebrated until the 15th, because that was a Sunday, and hence there would be no loss of time for the inhabitants of the capital. Besides, there was no question at all of celebrating the conquerors of the Bastille, but solely of a great distribution of the crosses of the Legion of Honor. This was the first time that their majesties displayed themselves to the people in all the magnificence of their power. The procession passed through the grand avenue of the Tuileries on its way to the Hôtel des Invalides, whose church, changed during the Revolution into a temple of Mars, had been restored to the Catholic worship by the Emperor and was to serve for the magnificent ceremonial of this day. It was also the first time that the Emperor used the privilege of passing through the garden of the Tuileries in a carriage. His cortege was superb. That of the Empress Josephine was not less brilliant. The rapt ecstasy of the people was at its height and cannot be described. By the Emperor's orders, I had mingled with the crowd so as to observe in what spirit they took part in the fete. I did not hear a murmur. So great whatever may have been said about it since was the enthusiasm of all classes for His Majesty. The Emperor and the Empress were received at the door of the Invalides by the Governor and the Countess Seguin, Grand Master of Ceremonies, and at the entrance to the church by Cardinal du Belloy, at the head of a large number of the clergy. After the Mass, Monsieur de la Lessepade, Grand Chancellor of the Legion of Honor, pronounced a discourse which was followed by the roll call of the Grand Officers of the Legion. Then the Emperor seated himself, put on his hat, and repeated in a loud voice the formula of the oath, at the end of which all the legionaries shouted, "I swear it!" And at once 1,000 times repeated cries of "Long live the Emperor!" resounded throughout the church and beyond it. A singular circumstance enhanced the interest excited by the ceremony, while the knights of the new order were passing one after another in front of the Emperor, who received them. A man of the people, wearing a round jacket, came and stood on the steps of the throne. His Majesty seemed somewhat astonished and paused for an instant. The man was questioned and showed his certificate. At once the Emperor showed eagerness to have him draw near and gave him the decoration with a brisk accolade. On returning, the cortege followed the same road, passing again through the Tuileries Garden. July 18th, 3 days after the ceremony, the Emperor left St. Cloud for the camp of Boulogne. I thought His Majesty would be willing to dispense with my presence for several days, and as it was a number of years since I had seen my family, that I would experience the very natural pleasure in seeing them again and conversing with my relatives about the singular circumstances in which I had found myself placed since we parted. I would have felt, I confess, great joy in chatting with them about my present condition and my expectations, and I needed the expansion and the confidence of domestic intimacy to compensate for the constraint and annoyances which my service imposed on me. Therefore, I asked permission to go and spend 8 days at Perwelz. It was granted without difficulty, and I lost no time in starting. But what was my astonishment when, on the very day after my arrival, I received by courier a letter from Count Remusat, who commanded me to rejoin the Emperor without delay, adding that His Majesty had need of me, and that I must occupy myself with nothing but getting there promptly. In spite of the disappointment I had experienced on receiving such orders, I nevertheless felt flattered at having become so necessary to the great man who had deigned to admit me to his service. Hence I bade farewell to my family without delay. His Majesty had scarcely arrived in Bologna when he set off again on an excursion of several days to the departments of the north. I was at Bologna before he returned, and I hastened to organize the service of His Majesty, who found everything ready on his arrival. which did not prevent his telling me that I had been absent a long time. Since I am on that subject, I will set down here, although it will be to anticipate by years, one or two circumstances which will give the reader a chance to judge for himself of the rigorous assiduity to which I was obliged to restrict myself by reason of the fatigues incident to my continual journeys. In the train of the emperor, I had contracted a malady of the bladder, from which I suffered horribly. For a long time I armed myself against my pains by patient dieting. But the anguish of having at length become totally insupportable, I requested His Majesty in 1808 to give me a month to have myself treated. Dr. Boyer had told me that a month was the least time strictly necessary for my cure, and that without it my malady would become incurable. My request was granted. I went to St. Cloud to the family of my wife. Mr. Ivan, the emperor's surgeon, came to see me every day. A week had hardly elapsed when he told me that His Majesty thought that I must be pretty well cured, and that he desired that I should resume my service. This desire was very equivalent to an order. I felt it, and I returned to the emperor, who, seeing me pale and suffering, deigned to say 1,000 kind things to me, but not a word of a new leave of absence. These 2 absences are the only ones I took during 16 years. Hence, on my return from Moscow and during the campaign of France, my illness had attained its extremest phase. And if I quitted the emperor at Fontainebleau, it was because it was impossible, notwithstanding all my attachment for so good a master, for me to serve him any longer. After this separation, which was so painful to me, a year hardly sufficed to cure me, and not entirely even then. But I shall have to speak of this sad epoch later on. I return to the recital of facts which prove that I could, with more justice, and some others have believed myself a great personage, since my humble services seem to be indispensable to the master of Europe. A good many habitués of the Tuileries would have had more trouble than I should to demonstrate their utility. Is there too much vanity in what I've just said? And the chamberlains, will they not have reason to be vexed by it? I can't say about that. And I will go on with my story. The emperor clung to his habits. He would, as has been seen, been served by me in preference to anyone else. And yet I ought to say that these gentlemen of the chamber were all full of zeal and devotion. But I was the longest in service, and I never quitted him. One day the emperor asked for some tea. In the middle of the day, Monsieur Seneschal was on duty. He made it and presented it to His Majesty, who found it detestable. I was summoned. The emperor complained to me that someone wanted to poison him. That was his word when anything tasted bad. Going back to the pantry, I poured from the same teapot a cup, which I arranged and carried to His Majesty with 2 silver-gilt teaspoons, according to custom, one to taste of it before the emperor and the other for him. This time he found the tea excellent. He complimented me on it with the benevolent familiarity he sometimes used towards his attendants, and on giving me back the cup, he pulled my ears and said, "Now teach them how to make tea. They know nothing about it." Monsieur de Bourrienne, whose excellent memoirs I have read with the greatest pleasure, says somewhere that the emperor in his moments of good humor would pinch his intimates by the tip of the ear. I have my own experience that he pinched the whole of it, and often both ears at once, and that with a master hand. It is also said in the same memoirs that he only gave his little friendly tap to 2 fingers, in that Monsieur de Bourrienne is very modest. I can again attest thereupon that His Majesty, although his hand was not large, distributed his favors much more largely, but this species of caress, as well as the preceding, was given and received as a mark of special kindliness, and far from anyone complaining of it then, I have heard more than one dignitary say with pride, like that sergeant of the comedy, "Master, try it again. The blow on my cheek is still too warm." In his private life, the emperor was nearly always gay, amiable, chatting familiarly with his attendants and questioning them about their family, their affairs, and even their pleasures. His toilet finished, his face suddenly changed. He was grave, thoughtful, He resumed his imperial air. It has been said that he often struck the domestics of his household. That is false. I never but once saw him yield to an impulse of that description, and certainly the circumstances which caused it, and the reparation which followed it, may render it, if not excusable, at least easy to understand. It is the fact which I witnessed and which occurred in the environs of Vienna the day after the death of Marshal Lannes. The emperor was profoundly affected. He had not spoken a word during his toilette. He was hardly dressed when he demanded his horse. An unlucky chance would have it that Monsieur Jardin, his groom, was not in the stables at the time when it was saddled, and the stableman did not put his usual bridle on the horse. His Majesty was barely mounted when the animal backed, reared, and the rider fell heavily to the ground. Monsieur Jardin came up just as the emperor rose irritated, and in his first transport of anger he received a cut of the whip across the face. Monsieur Jardin went away in despair at an ill usage to which his Majesty had not accustomed him, and a few hours afterwards Monsieur de Caulaincourt, Grand Equerry, finding himself alone with his Majesty, described to him the chagrin of his head groom. The emperor expressed keen regret for his vivacity, and Monsieur Jardin, summoned, talked to him with a kindness which effaced his injustice, and sent him a few days later a gratuity of 3,000 francs. I have been told that a similar thing happened to Monsieur Vignogna, Senior, in Egypt, but if that were true, ought two such facts in the whole life of the emperor, coupled with circumstances so well calculated to make even the mildest man act out of character, to suffice to draw upon Napoleon the odious reproach of beating cruelly the persons who waited on him. Chapter 11. At the headquarters of Pont-de-Brique, the emperor worked as much as in his cabinet at the Tuileries after his excursions on horseback, his inspections, his visits, his reviews. He took his repast in haste and re-entered his cabinet, where he often worked a great part of the night. He thus led the same sort of life as in Paris. In his turns on horseback, Rustem followed him everywhere. The latter always carried with him a little silver flask of eau de vie for the use of his Majesty, who, for that matter, seldom availed himself of it. The army of Bologna was composed of about 150,000 infantry and 90,000 cavalry, divided into four principal camps: the camp of the right, the camp of the left, the camp of Wimereux, and the camp of Ambletuza. His Majesty the Emperor had his headquarters at Pont-de-Brique, so called, I have been told, because there had been discovered there the brick foundations of an ancient camp of Caesar. Pont-de-Brique, as I have said before, is half a league or thereabouts from Bologna, and His Majesty's headquarters was established in the only house of the place that was then habitable. The headquarters was guarded by a mounted post of the Imperial Guard. The four camps were on a very high cliff dominating the sea in such a manner that on a fair day one might see the English coast. In the right camp, barracks had been established for the Emperor, Admiral Brie, Marshal Soult, and Monsieur de Craye, then Minister of the Navy. The Emperor's barrack, constructed by the care of Monsieur Sordi, acting as chief engineer of military communications, and whose nephew, Monsieur Lecaderoux, attached at this period as aide-de-camp to the staff of Marshal Soult, had been so kind as to furnish me with information which is not specially within my competence. The barrack of the Emperor, I say, was made of planks, like the booths of a fair, but with this difference, that the planks were carefully wrought and painted light gray. In shape, it was a long square, having two semicircular pavilions at each extremity. It was surrounded by a circular piazza, closed by a wooden lattice, and lighted from without by a reflection 4 feet apart. The windows were placed at the sides. The pavilion, which looked out to the sea, was composed of 3 rooms and a lobby. The principal room served for the council chamber and was decorated with silver-gray paper. The ceiling was painted with golden clouds, amidst which could be seen a background of blue sky, an eagle holding the thunder, and guided towards England by a star, the Emperor's tutelary star. In the middle of this chamber was a large oval table covered with a green cloth without fringe. There was nothing in front of this table but His Majesty's armchair made of simple native wood, covered with green morocco and stuffed with horsehair, and which could be taken to pieces. On the table was a boxwood stand for ink and pens. This was the only furniture of the council chamber where nobody but the emperor could sit down, the generals standing before him and having nothing but the hilt of their swords to lean on during these councils, which sometimes lasted 3 or 4 hours. The council chamber was entered through a lobby. In this lobby on the right hand was His Majesty's bedchamber, which was closed by a glass door and lighted by a window which opened on the camp of the right, with a view of the sea on the left. Here was the emperor's iron bedstead, with a large green sarcenet curtain fastened to the ceiling by a ring of gilded copper. It had 2 pallets, a hair mattress, 2 bolsters, one at the head and the other at the foot, and no pillow, and 2 coverlets, one in white cotton, the other in green sarcenet, wadded and quilted. 2 very simple folding chairs stood beside it. The casement was hung with small green sarcenet curtains. This room was papered in rose color, with a lacework tracery and an Etruscan border. Opposite the sleeping room was another chamber parallel to it, in which was a sort of telescope which had cost 12,000 francs. This instrument was about 4 feet long by 1 diameter. It was mounted on a mahogany support some 3 feet in height, and the case which served to contain it was shaped almost like a piano. In the same room, on 2 stools, was a yellow leather casket which contained 3 complete changes of dress and linen. This was the campaign wardrobe of His Majesty. Above it was a square hat, lined with white satin and much worn. The emperor had a very sensitive head. He did not like new hats. He kept the same ones a long while. The main body of the imperial barrack was divided into 3 rooms, a salon, a vestibule, and a large dining room which communicated with the kitchens by a lobby parallel to that I have just described. Outside of the barrack and in the direction of the kitchens was a little thatched cabin which served as a laundry and scullery. The barrack of Admiral Bouilly was arranged in the same way as the emperor's, but on a smaller scale. The signal semaphore was behind it, a sort of maritime telegraph for making signals. A little further off was the ordnance tower, a terrible battery composed of 6 mortars, 6 howitzers, and 12 24-pounders. These 6 mortars, the greatest in caliber that had ever been made, were 16 inches thick, carried 45 pounds of powder in the chamber, and sent 700-pound bombs 1,500 fathoms into the air and 1.5 leagues out to the sea. Each bomb fired cost the state 300 francs. Lances 12 feet in length were employed in touching off these frightful machines, and the cannoneer protected himself as much as possible by putting his head between his legs and not rising until after the discharge. The emperor wished to launch the first bomb himself. Marshal Soul's barrack was on the right of the ordnance tower. It was built like the hut of a savage, covered with thatch down to the ground, lighted from above, and with a door by which one descended into apartments which seemed buried. The principal room was round. There was a large work table in it, covered with green cloth and surrounded by small capstools. The last barrack was that of M. de Cray, Minister of the Navy, which was built and arranged like that of Marshal Soult. From his barrack, the emperor could observe all the maneuvers at sea, and the telescope of which I have spoken was so good that Dover Castle, with its garrison, was, so to say, under the eyes of His Majesty. The right camp established on the cliff was divided into streets, each of which bore the name of some distinguished general. This cliff was bristling with batteries from Boulogne and Amaltuza, that is to say, for a distance of more than 10 leagues. To go from Boulogne to the right camp there was but one road, which began in the Rue des Vieillards and passed to the cliff between His Majesty's barrack and those of Messieurs Bouilly, Soult, and de Cray. When the emperor wished to go down on the beach at low tide, he had to make a great detour. One day he complained of it very loudly. Monsieur Bonafou, maritime prefect of Bologna, heard His Majesty's complaints, and addressing himself to Monsieur Sordi, engineer of military communications, he asked if it were not possible to remedy this serious inconvenience. The engineer replied that the thing was feasible. Means could be found by which His Majesty could go directly from his barrack to the beach, but that on account of the excessive elevation of the cliff, it would be necessary to dig the road in a zigzag to avoid the rapidity of the descent. Make it as you think best, said the emperor, but I must go down by it in 3 days. The skillful engineer set to work. In 3 days and 3 nights, a road of stones fastened together by iron clamps was constructed, and the emperor, charmed by such diligence and talent, set Monsieur Sordi down for the next distribution of crosses. It is not known by what regrettable negligence the skillful man was forgotten. The harbor of Bologna contained about 1,700 vessels, such as flatboats, gunboats, skiffs, lighters, bomb catchers, etc. The entrance of the port was defended by an enormous chain and by 4 forts, 2 on the right, 2 on the left. The Moussoir fort on the left was armed by 3 formidable batteries, placed one above the other, the second and third by 36-pounders. On the right of this fort was a tow bridge, and behind this bridge an old tower called the Croix Tower, garnished with good and handsome batteries. On the left, about a quarter of a league from Fort Moussoir, was Fort de la Crèche, advanced a good way into the sea, built of cut stone and terrible. On the right of this, finally, was a wooden fort, armed in a prodigious manner and pierced by a large opening, which was exposed at low tide. On the cliff at the left of the city, the same height as the other, or very near it, was the left camp. Here could be seen the barrack of Prince Joseph, then colonel of the 4th Regiment of the line. This barrack was thatched. At the foot of this camp and of the cliff, the emperor had a basin dug by a part of the troops.